The sun set over the snowy wilderness, casting shadows on the icy road. A lone truck rumbled through, its headlights piercing the dusk. The burly, arrogant driver gripped the wheel, unaware the wilderness had other plans. As the truck rounded a sharp bend, something darted across the road. The driver slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the icy surface. He leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. There, standing in the middle of the road, was a wolf. Its fur was a mix of gray and white, blending perfectly with the snowy backdrop. The wolf's eyes glowed in the dim light, locked onto the driver with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. But the driver wasn't the type to back down. He rolled down his window, the cold air rushing in, and shouted, "Get out of the way, mutt!" The wolf didn't move. It stood its ground, its gaze never wavering. The driver's temper flared. He threw the truck into park, grabbed a metal flashlight from the passenger seat, and stepped out into the freezing night. "You want to play tough, huh?" he muttered, advancing toward the wolf. The animal's lips curled back, revealing sharp teeth, but the driver didn't care. He swung the flashlight, aiming for the wolf's head. The wolf dodged with surprising agility, but the driver wasn't done. He kicked out, his heavy boot connecting with the wolf's side. The animal yelped, stumbling backward. For a moment, the driver felt a surge of triumph. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the silence. "That's what you get for messing with me," he shouted. But his victory was short-lived. The wolf's yelp had barely faded when another sound reached his ears, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all directions. He turned, his flashlight beam sweeping across the darkness. What he saw made his blood run cold. Eyes, dozens of them, glowing in the shadows. The wolf he had kicked wasn't alone. It was part of a pack, and they were closing in. The driver's bravado evaporated, replaced by a primal fear. He stumbled back toward the truck, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But the wolves were faster. They moved as one, a coordinated force of nature, cutting off his retreat. The driver swung the flashlight wildly, but it was no use. The wolves circled him, their growls growing louder, more menacing. He reached the truck, yanking the door open, but before he could climb inside, a powerful force knocked him to the ground. The flashlight skidded out of his hand, its beam flickering as it rolled away. He looked up, and there, standing over him, was the wolf he had kicked. Its eyes burned with a ferocity that made his stomach churn. The driver opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The wolf lunged, and the world went black. When he came to, the truck was still there, its engine idling softly. The wolves were gone, but the memory of their eyes, their growls, lingered like a nightmare. The driver scrambled to his feet, his body trembling, and climbed into the cab. He didn't look back as he drove away, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The wilderness had taught him a lesson he would never forget, but the question remained, had he escaped, or was this only the beginning? The truck sped down the icy road, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a desperate plea for escape. The driver's hand shook on the wheel, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The encounter with the wolves had left him rattled, his arrogance shattered like glass against stone. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see glowing eyes chasing him through the night. But the road behind him was empty, swallowed by the vast, unyielding wilderness. For miles, he drove in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the crunch of tires on snow. His mind raced, replaying the events over and over. The wolf's eyes, the pack's growls, the feeling of being hunted. It all felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new emotion crept in: anger. How dare those animals challenge him? How dare they make him feel weak? He clenched his jaw, his pride flaring up like a dying ember reignited. "They're just animals," he muttered to himself. "I'm the one in control." The words felt hollow, but he clung to them like a lifeline. He needed to believe he was still in charge, that the wilderness hadn't beaten him. As the road stretched on, he began to convince himself that the encounter had been a fluke, a momentary lapse in his dominance. By the time he reached the next town, a small, dimly lit outpost nestled in the middle of nowhere, he had almost convinced himself he was untouchable again. He pulled into a gas station, the fluorescent lights harsh against the night. The attendant, a grizzled old man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, eyed him suspiciously as he stepped out of the truck. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the man said, his voice gravelly. The driver forced a laugh, though it sounded more like a cough. "Just a long night," he replied, brushing snow off his jacket. He paid for the gas and grabbed a coffee from the station's vending machine, the bitter liquid doing little to calm his nerves. As he stood there, sipping the coffee and staring out at the darkness, he noticed something strange. The town was eerily quiet. No cars on the road, no people on the streets. It was as if the place had been abandoned. He shook off the feeling, chalking it up to exhaustion. But as he climbed back into his truck and drove through the town, the silence grew heavier, more oppressive. The buildings loomed like shadows, their windows dark and lifeless. He turned onto the main road, the one that would take him out of the town and back into the wilderness. That's when he saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road, silhouetted against the moonlight. The driver slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. As the truck skidded to a stop, the figure stepped into the headlights. It was a woman, her hair wild and tangled, her clothes torn and dirty. She raised a hand, shielding her eyes from the light, and stumbled toward the truck. The driver hesitated, his instincts warring with his curiosity. Something about the woman felt off, but before he could decide what to do, she reached the driver's side window and knocked on the glass. Her eyes were wide, frantic. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "You have to help me. They're coming." The driver rolled down the window, his unease growing. "Who's coming?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The woman glanced over her shoulder, her breath visible in the cold air. "The wolves," she whispered. "They've been following me for hours. I thought I lost them, but—" Her voice broke, and she looked back at him, her eyes pleading. "Please, you have to let me in." The driver's mind raced. He didn't trust her, didn't trust the situation. But the fear in her eyes was real, and it stirred something deep within him, a flicker of the humanity he thought he'd buried under layers of arrogance. Against his better judgment, he unlocked the door. "Get in," he said gruffly. The woman didn't need to be told twice. She climbed into the passenger seat, her movements hurried and clumsy. As she shut the door, the driver noticed something strange. Her hands were covered in scratches, some fresh, others scabbed over. He didn't have time to ask about them, though, because she was already speaking again, her words tumbling out in a rush. "We need to go. Now. They're close. I can feel it." The driver didn't argue. He put the truck in gear and hit the gas, the tire spinning on the icy road before gaining traction. As they sped out of the town, the woman kept glancing out the window, her body tense. The driver wanted to ask her questions, who she was, what had happened, why the wolves were after her, but the words caught in his throat. There was something about her presence that made the air feel heavier, the night darker. After a few minutes of driving in silence, the woman finally spoke again. "Thank you," she said softly. "I didn't think anyone would stop." The driver grunted in response, his eyes fixed on the road. "You're lucky I did," he said. "Not many people out here at this time of night." The woman nodded, but she didn't seem to be listening. Her gaze was distant, her mind clearly elsewhere. The driver glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, taking in her disheveled appearance. She looked like she'd been through hell, but there was something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It was as if she didn't belong in this world, as if she were a ghost clinging to the edges of reality. Before he could dwell on it further, a sound broke the silence, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a howl, long and mournful, echoing through the night. The woman's head snapped toward the window, her eyes wide with terror. "They're here," she whispered. The driver's grip tightened on the wheel. "How many?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she pointed ahead, her hand shaking. The driver followed her gaze, and his heart skipped a beat. Standing in the middle of the road, just like before, was a wolf. But this one was different. It was larger, its fur a deep, inky black that seemed to absorb the light. Its eyes glowed like embers, fixed on the truck with an intensity that made the driver's skin crawl. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop, just a few feet from the wolf. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wolf stared at them, its gaze unblinking, and the driver stared back, his mind racing. He could feel the woman's fear radiating off her like heat, but he couldn't look away from the wolf. There was something in its eyes, something ancient, something knowing. And then, without warning, the wolf stepped aside, disappearing into the shadows. The driver let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his hands trembling on the wheel. "What the hell was that?" he muttered. The woman didn't answer. She was staring out the window, her face pale. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're not done with us." The driver didn't need to be told twice. He hit the gas, the truck lurching forward. But as they drove, the feeling of unease only grew. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The woman kept glancing out the window, her body tense, as if she expected something to leap out at any moment. And then it happened. A loud thud echoed through the truck as something heavy landed on the roof. The driver swerved, his heart pounding, but whatever was up there held on. The woman screamed, her hands flying to her mouth, as claws scraped against the metal above them. The driver's mind raced. What could he do? If he stopped, they'd be sitting ducks. But if he kept driving, whatever was on the roof would eventually find a way in. Before he could decide, the woman grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Look!" she shouted, pointing ahead. The driver's eyes snapped back to the road, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The road was gone, replaced by a sheer drop into a ravine. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the truck skidded toward the edge. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought they were going over. But the truck came to a stop just inches from the drop, the front wheels hanging over the edge. The driver sat there, his heart pounding, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The woman was breathing heavily beside him, her eyes wide with terror. And then, slowly, they both turned to look at the roof. The scraping had stopped. The truck was silent, the only sound their ragged breathing. The driver reached for the door handle, his hand shaking. "Stay here," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The woman didn't argue. She watched as he stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the snow. The night was still, the air thick with tension. He walked around to the front of the truck, his eyes scanning the roof. But there was nothing there. No wolf, no creature, no sign of what had been on top of them. He let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping in relief. But as he turned to get back in the truck, he froze. The woman was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door still closed. He stared at it, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. Where had she gone? How had she disappeared without a trace? And then, from the darkness behind him, came a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws on snow. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. And there, standing just a few feet away, was the black wolf. Its eyes glowed like fire, its lips curled back in a snarl. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, emerging from the shadows, were dozens of wolves, their eyes fixed on him with a hunger that made his stomach churn. The driver backed away, his hands raised in a futile gesture of defense. But he knew it was no use. The wolves were closing in, their growls growing louder, more menacing. He stumbled, his foot slipping on the icy ground, and fell to his knees. The black wolf stepped forward, its gaze never leaving his. And then, with a final, bone-chilling howl, it lunged. The driver's scream echoed through the night, but there was no one around to hear it. The wilderness had claimed another victim, its secrets buried deep beneath the snow. And as the wolves disappeared into the darkness, the only sound left was the wind, whispering through the trees, like a warning to those who dared to enter its domain.